We're now on the top of Samach Daled Amud Beis, and we discussed the maklos that we use to carry and hold and suspend the Korban Pesach in order that they could do the hafshata in event that there weren't enough hooks. And the Mishnah wants to know, what about on Erev Pesach Chalils B'Shabbos? Because here we have a problem. They could not prepare these maklos and smoothen them out. That becomes meleches memachik, and since it's not critical and it's something they could have done before Shabbos, they didn't allow that on Shabbos. So we have to find a substitute. That's what Rabbi Eliezer here on the top of the Omen is going to try to give us a substitute for the maklos. And he says that Pesach Chalils B'Shabbos is meiniach yodo al kotev chavero v'yad chavero al ketefo v'tolo mafshet. The arm itself became like a makel. So one person would stretch his arm out and rest it on the shoulder of the fellow next to him, and then they would be told the Korban Pesach on the shoulder, on the arms, the outstretched arm, and then the Kohanim would do the hafshata and crow. Once they took out they removed the hides, then they would cut and make an incision in order to remove the kishkis, the inner part of the Korban Pesach, that which needs haktorah al gabi mizbeach on the marocha. That's called the chelev. And isano b'mogis. There was a certain kind of a flat utensil, a klishari, so it was called a mogis, and that would be used to transport the emurim, the chalavim that had to be placed in haktorah on the eish hamizbeach, the ketirin al gabi mizbeach. Now, how do they get the Korban back home from the Azara if the 14th is on Shabbos? They would have to carry it through Rishus Harabim in order to get home. And Tiltal Daramas Rishus Harabim is prohibited. So the Mishnah tells us that what they did was each one of these kitos would leave the Azara and remain stationary, waiting for Shabbos to end, and only then to carry the lamb through Rishus Harabim back home in order to begin the process of roasting the lamb on Motzi Shabbos and eating the Korban Pesach. So Yotza Kas Rishona. Now, again, you have three kitos, one after the other, coming out of the Azara and stationing themselves in places X, Y, and Z until Motzei Shabbos. So the first group went the furthest to give room for the second group, and then the third group to the first group. Yoshvala Bahar Bayis. They set themselves up on the Har Bayis, and there's a whole discussion here about the midos of the Har Bayis, which was 500 amas and 500 amas, all within the choma that surrounded Yerushalayim. So they would set themselves up really on the outskirts of the Har Bayis. And then the second group, Shnia, they left the Azor. They sat, again, a little bit further than the Azor, but not as far as the Har Bayis, the end of the Har Bayis. They would sit in the Chel. And the Chel was an area outside the Azora called the Ezras Nashim. It's actually between a place called the Soreg and the Ezras Nashim. And that was closer, but not exactly as you entered into the Har Bayis. And then the Shlishis, Bimkomo Medis, the third kat would actually remain in the Azor until after Shabbos. They weren't taking anyone else's space because they were the final group. And after Shabbos, they would bring Kishachashecha Yotzu Vitzolois Pischei. Then they went back home, each one to his own home, and that's where they did the roasting of the Korban Pesach. We're up to now the Gemara here on the top of Samach Daled Amud Beis. Omer Rabbi Yitzchak, Eina Pesach Nichchad, Elo B'Shalosh Kitot Shel Shloshim B'nei Adam. Each kat should have a minimum of 30, totaling 90. My timer, what led Rabbi Yitzchak to this conclusion? You and I would have said that it's enough that you have 10 in each one of the three groups. Of course, you have Kahal, and you have Ada, and you have Yisrael. Each of those three requires 10, and each reflects on one of the three kitos respectively. The answer is that Rabbi Yitzchak vacillated. He wasn't sure what this requirement of this threefold requirement, Kol of Ada and Yisrael meant. The Sapkale, Iba Vasachas, Iba Zecher Zeh. Bazecher Zeh meaning that you need one group called a Kol, and that's made up of 10. The second group and third group, each group is made up of 10. But he had a tzad to say that perhaps it's Bavasachas, that the requirement of Kol, Ada, and Yisrael was with regard to each individual group of the three groups. Hence, in order to cover that possibility, you would have to have 30 people in each one of the three groups, each group represented both Kahal and Ada and Yisrael, 10, 10, and 10. Ilka, therefore, we need 3 kitos of 30. Why? To Ibe Vasachas, if the Torah requires all three, meaning Kahal, Ada, and Yisrael, the Vasachas, in each group, Ha'ika, he has it. Ve'iba Zecher Zef, the Torah only required 10, Ha'ika, so 30 has 10. I mean, in other words, there's no Baltosov over here by having 30 when all you need is 10. So he covered all his bases in the suffix by having 30 in each one of the three kitos. However, the Gemara mathematically calculates that in reality, you don't have to have 90 people. All you need is 50. Why? Hilkach, Bechamshinami Sagi. Why is it enough to have 50? The Ayel Talsin the Avdi. First, you can have 30 people go in on the first round, the first kat. They're going to finish their Korban Pesach. And Aili Asara, Vinafka Asara. Let 10 of those 30 go out and 10 come in to replace them. So you're still left with the number 30. And the same thing with regard to the third group is Aili Asara Vinafki Asara. So basically, you're only going to have to introduce 10 and 10 to the original 30. Because the original 30, 10 will drop out, and then you bring in the second group of 10. So you now have 40, all told. I mean, again, there'll only be 30 in the Azar at one time. And then you bring in the third group of 10, and you've gone up to 50, but again, there'll only be 30 at any time. And after the first cut went in, the doors of the Azar were closed. Now, what does that mean? Did somebody actually close the door? Or did the wind close the door? Itmar. Abai Omar Ninalu Tanan. It doesn't say Nalu, but rather Ninalu. Ninalu seems to indicate Me'alehem, that it happened magically. And Rav Omar Noalim Tanan. His Girsa had it that Noalim means you actively, some Kohen was appointed with the job of locking the Azar. My Beinayu. What is the machlokis here all about between Abai and Rav? Ikebeinayu the Mismach Nissan. Can't we rely on this miracle that miraculously from above the door was closed, the gate to the Azar was closed at its exact precise time? Abai Omar, Ninalu Tanan, he's going to learn the Mishnah Ninalu, Me'alehem, again by themselves, and Kamadi Aili Malu. In other words, as many as would let in, meaning who would let them in? It was the nest, the great supernatural miracle of the doors closing. We don't have to point to any Kohen to go ahead and lock the doors of the Azara, because after each kat was filled in, the doors of the Azara would automatically close. Rav Amar No'alin Lo Samchinan Anisa. Even though it's true that there would have been a miracle in any event, but we don't rely on miracles. We do it through human activity, human intervention. We'll see this in Kriyas Yamsuf, this coming parsha. If you're aware of the Nachshon ben Aminadav miracle, Hashem says, "Daber b'nisov yisol." They had to go into the Yam up until their noses, until Hashem split the Yam. So man has to take that initiative. That's Rava. We don't do things based on miracles. And the Gemara points out that there's a Mishnah in Edios, and it's going to lend itself again to two interpretations of what happened to the doors. Did they close automatically, or did the Kohen close it? In this Mishnah in Edios. But Tanan, Rabbi Yehuda. Now, by way of background, there was a big controversy between Akivia, or actually his name was Akavia ben Malalel, and the Chachamim. It had to do with Hashkos Maim of Mesota, whether or not you would do the Hashkos Maim of Mesota even on behalf of a Giores, or in that case it was a Shivcha Shenishtachar. And Rabbi Yehuda Akavia argued that there's no such thing as Hashkos Sota with regard to a Shivcha, and the Chacham held, yes, all the Dini Sota apply. And at some point, it seems that Akavia made a kind of a disparaging comment about the Chachamim as to why they wanted to allow for a Giores, a convert, or Shivcha Shenistach was a convert, to be included in Hashkas Mei Sota. And then he blurted out apparently some sort of a comment that they were under the influence of Shmai Vavtalion, who themselves were Gerim, and therefore they wanted to upgrade the status of the Gerim. In any event, they wanted to put him into Nidui. And there was one transmission that held that they actually put Akavi ben Mahalal, who was one of the Gadol Adars in his generation, into Nidui, into excommunication, because of the way he expressed himself. So Rabbi Yehuda says, Chas v'shalom, you got the story wrong. It's impossible that they would have put in such a Gadol as Akavi ben Mahalal into Nidui. Why? She'ein azor nenelos al kol adam Yisrael b'chachma v'yira b'chet ka'Akavia ben Mahalal. When the doors of the Azor would close on Erev Pesach, and there was a great kahal of people that were inside the Azor to bring their Korban Pesach, you wouldn't find one person in that great kahal who was anywhere near the greatness in Chachma and Yira of Akavi ben Mahalal. Now, how do you interpret the word Nin Elis? What does Nin Elis mean? Abai mitaris l'taimei. Abai is going to learn Nin Elis means that it was closed by the miracle, and Rav mitaris l'taimei that the doors were closed humanly, by human effort. Abai mitaris l'taimei ein bazar shach and Nin Elal kol adam Yisrael b'chachma yirachet ka'Akavi ben Mahalal. So he's going to say Nin Allah. Nin Allah means by itself, miraculously. And Rav mitaris l'taimei he's going to interpret the Mishnah Ein bazar b'shach no'alim also, not Nin Allah me'eleh, but no'alim also. Al kol Yisrael b'chachma b'yir b'chet ki Akavia ben Mahalal. Now it's really interesting that there's a discussion here about this machlokas between Abai and Rav about whether we're actually somech al nisim or not somech al nisim, and the repercussions of that machlokas. That's a fascinating sugi. Now the Brisa records that despite the masses of people that came in on Erev Pesach in the afternoon with their Korbanos Pesach, so there was very large crowds in the Azor. Nevertheless, lo nismaich odom, no one got crushed as a result of the massive amount of people. Chutz mi Pesach echad. On one Pesach, Shahaya b'mei Hillel, at the time of Hillel, shenismaich bo zaken echad, one elderly Jew, Nebuch, was crushed. So, and they had a name for that particular Pesach on that year. They call it Pesach Me'uchin. Me'uchin is miloshen nismaich. Nismaich means he was crushed. And the Ramami wrote a book called Gilgule Nishamos, and he says that Zaken was a Gilgul of the Sar HaOfim. And the Sar HaOfim represents what's called Mevaser Ra, right? He was going to be killed, be executed. Anyway, so this Zaken was apparently a Mevaser Ra. He had bad news to tell us about Klal Yisrael, and therefore he was crushed to death. And not only that, he says that the neshama of Sarah Ophim, I'm sure you're all fascinated by this, but that neshama of Sarah Ophim ended up first in the shlish of Elisha. You may remember that Elisha had a sidekick who was who doubted the prophecy of Elisha. When Elisha prophesied that there would be an end to the famine in Shomron, he didn't believe. He was very pessimistic and facetious about the nevuah of Elisha. So he had bad news to say about Klal Yisrael, and that was the neshama of the Saraophim in the Shalish. Ultimately, that same neshama was misgalgel, was reincarnated in the body of this Zaken, who also apparently was looking ba'ayin ra on the masses of people that came to the Korban Pesach, and he was mavasa ra, so he himself got corrupt. This fellow Agrippas was a very strange king, very complicated personality. He was like some sort of a schizophrenic. He was a Russia. He put the Kohanim to death, but on the other hand, he was good to the Jews. I mean, he had other milas. Anyway, on one occasion, he wanted to take a census of Klal Yisrael. So what did he do? Omar, Leila Kohen Gadol. He figures, who's the one in all of Klal Yisrael who could is in a very special position. He could really determine the exact census of Klal Yisrael. It's the Kohen Gadol himself. And he told him, do me a favor, count how many Jews bring a Korban Pesach on Erev Pesach. Then we'll multiply by 10. Let's say the average Chabura was made of 10. And we would calculate the census of Klal Yisrael. That's how they took a census. They didn't count people by head. That was a no-no. So what did the Kohen Gadol do? Natal kuya mikol echad. From every Pesach, he took the kidney, and the kidney would be put somewhere. We'll see exactly where, and then he would count up the kidneys and know how many Pesachim there were. Nimtzu sham shishin ribui zuge kloyos. 600,000 pairs of kloyos, which means 600,000 times 2, that's 1.2 million. Kiflayim kiyotzim Mitzrayim, double the amount of the Shishim Ribu that we read about yesterday that left Mitzrayim. And that doesn't even include Chutz Mi Tameh V'Shaya Derech Rechok. In addition to this 1.2 million that brought the Korban Pesach, there were those who couldn't bring the Korban Pesach. And then we have to count up the women and children as well. So we're talking about a large population. At that time, there was a large Jewish population. The Ein Lecha Kol Pesach Pesach Nimno Olav Yotzer. Take out the word Yotzer. Shol Nimno Olav Me'asar B'nei Adam. So the average Chabura had at least a minimum of 10 people. So we're multiplying now 1.2 million by 10. Vayukarin also Pesach Me'ubin. And they called it not Pesach Moachin, Miloshin crushing, because that's Zakin, but Me'ubin means there was such a myriad, a massive amount of people. Me'uvin means fat, like large. The Gemara doesn't understand how the Kohen Gadol would have done this kind of thing. Not al kulia. Haboy aktura. The kloya is one of the members of the innards of the animal, which is called a murim, that requires haktara. How could he have taken it out just for the sake of the senses? And the answer is the hadar maktalu. All right, he took it out, he counted it, and then he was makted on the mizbeach. But wait a second, you're not allowed to take part of a murim out of the Korban Pesach and burn them on the mizbeach separately, segments, in increments. Because what the Torah says with regard to a Korban Shalom, we're going to apply the same principle to Korban Pesach, viktiro, in one lashon yachid. Shalo ya'arev chalaviv zem zeh. Each chalav had to be brought by itself to come maktalu chada chada. So Gemara answers yes. Each one was burnt by itself. In other words, after he counted up the kloyos, he brought each kloya on the mizbeach separately. The Gemara in the Hamni thought he brought all the kloyos on the mizbeach together, and that would be a violation of the principle of viktiro. Shlo ya'arev chalaviv zem zeh. Gemara is still not happy. But Tanya, it says in the pasuk there, at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, Viktiram, There's a pasuk that says Viktiro in Lashon Yachid. There's also a pasuk that says Viktiram in Lashon Rabim. Shekulo ki echad. That you take all the emurim of a particular korban and you makriv them at one time. And now we don't understand. The Kohen Gadol separated the kloya and brought the kloya to Mizbeach. Okay, he didn't bring it together with the other kloyas of other korbanos, something, but nevertheless, he didn't bring it all the emurim at the same time. Ella, Gemara says, no, we made a whole mistake here about understanding what the Kohen Gadol did. Tfisa bi'alma. All the Kohen did was he grabbed onto the kloya, to the what you call it, the kidney. The shakal minayu. In other words, he would take it out until he substituted for something else. So let's say he took a rock, a little small pebble, and he substituted for the kloya, and then he put the kloya back in. So he only took the kloya out for a second, and then he counted stones afterwards. He didn't have to separate the kloya from the rest of the korban. Here's a whole discussion as to why he had to use this whole system of kloyos and then count up the rocks or whatever he used. Why could he just separate one rock for each Korban Pesach and make that calculation? Kohanim omdim shuros. Kohanim were either in a line that held silver bazichin or gold bazichin, but never the twain shall meet. My timer, ilema dilma shakli de dava umaili de kaspa. Maybe if we're afraid that on this line there would be both Kohanim holding gold and holding silver, then maybe he would perhaps grab a mizrach that's made of gold and move it towards the mizbech. Then on the way back, he would be passed on. What would pass to him was a mizrach made of silver, and that violates the principle of ma'ilin b'kodesh ve'moridin. You can't do a horada b'kodesh from gold to silver. Is hachanami dilma shakli bar masayim uma'ayli bar mea. It's even if you'll guarantee me that all the mizrakos in that particular shura are made of the same metal, let it be silver, let it be gold, you still have a problem. Why? Because one mizrak is worth masayim and the other mizrak is worth mea. They were different weights of silver in each mizrak. So you would also have a problem of moridin b'kodesh. Ella, the answer is that's not called moridin b'kodesh. The hachi shapir tfei. But we're not worried about moridin b'kodesh. Gemara completely rejects the havamina here that the issue was moridin b'kodesh. This is not moridin b'kodesh. That's not the issue. But rather, shapir tfei. It's all a matter of aesthetic beauty and kavod for the Beis Hamikdash. And remember that these spoons would come to a sharp spitz. Although all the bazichim that were used for kabbalah sadam, they were afraid that the dam, if the bazich with dam was placed on the ground, would come to be karush, and then it's possible. But there was no problem with the baziche levona shalechem aponim. These were the two bazichim with which they would take out what's called levona, a kometz of levona, and these the levona was situated between the two piles of 6 lachmei tod on each side. The yifros halechem, and what we're afraid of is that if they came to a spitz, these bazichim that were used for the levona of the shtei lechem, of the lechem aponim, then he might be tempted when he grabs on to some of the levona to fill it up. He might take his hand out for a minute from the bazich, and since it's on an angle, it will tip over towards one side and maybe push over the lechem aponim, shemi anichem, the yifros halechem. And therefore, what they wanted to make sure was that it would have a flat bottom, which was a classic bazich, and there's no dam inside, so we don't have to worry about shema yikrosh hadam. And this way, he would put it down gently. It wasn't tipping in any direction, and he wouldn't have to tip over the lachme the lachmi toad, the shtela, the lechem apon. Shachat Yisrael v'kibul hakohen. So the shechita was done by Yisrael. So the Gemara immediately asks, Lo sagir l'lav Yisrael. Why does it have to mention the Yisrael? Let the kohen do the shechita. He gufa kamashmon the shechita b'zar kshera. The Mishnah is not advocating that the Yisrael do the shechita. There's no reason to give preference to the Yisrael, but rather the Mishnah is telling us that if Yisrael did the shechita, it's kosher. The shechita b'zar kshera. The shechita doesn't require a kohen. Now, why does the Mishnah have to emphasize that the Makabel was a Kohen? Because from the point after Shechita of Kabbalah and onwards, all the Avoda would have to be done by a Kohen. As we mentioned before, there's a Rashi elsewhere that seems to say that there was actually a recommendation that Yisrael would do the Shechita. No snow l'chaver shmagila mizbeach shmamet mino. Holacha shalo beregel havi holacha. One of the four avodas is holacha, to transmit the dam in the mizrach from wherever the Kabbalah was over to the mizbeach. But here he's not moving in any direction because he's going to just pass it on to his colleague, his next kohen who's next on line, contiguous to him. He didn't take even a step towards the mizbeach. So what happened to the holacha? And we're going to have to derive from here that holacha means nothing more than making sure that the dam gets to the mizbeach. And if, for example, forget about Korban Pesach, but in any Korban, let's say the Kohen who was makabel, that he was situated right near the mizbeach, he didn't have to do halacha. All he did was the zrika straight away. So halacha shelo b'regel havi halacha. Halacha means when you stretch it out with your arm in order to do the zrika. That's itself halacha. So Gemara rejects this. No, Dilma who denied Purta. Maybe you don't need a halacha from place X where the Kabbalah was all the way to the Mizbeach. You just need a little bit of halacha purka, and that's what they did. Each Kohen, when he got the kos, he would take a step in the direction of the Mizbeach. So if you're telling me that in any event he did a halacha, so what's the chiddush here of the Mishnah? Why did the Tana have to go through this whole arichus and tell you that one Kohen passed it on to the other, to teach us that Barov Am Hajus Melech, that we really, really advocate that there be many, many Kohanim online, because the more Kohanim online, the more Hajus Melech there is. Now, the question that bothered my mind, I couldn't find anyone to address this question. So why is that recorded here with regard to the Korban Pesach? Any Korban, you could always say that the halach should be done by a massive amount of Kohanim passing it on down the assembly line because of Barov Am Hajus Melech. It seems to me, I'm not sure if this is right, that Barov Am Hajus Melech is a specific halach in Korban Pesach. And we see that Korban Pesach is unique because we had the Hallel and the Tkiyos with the Chatzotros. All this is Barov Am. This is all Hidur Melech. When we declare, God, you have saved the people of Israel during the time of Makas Bechoros, and you brought us out, and you gave us this great mitzvah of Korban Pesach to memorialize that great miracle. This is all Kvod Hashem, way, way beyond any other Korban. And therefore, Barov Am, I just know. If you like it, take it. Kibel es hamoli umachsis harekon. First, he would receive the mizrach that had dam in it, and then he would get the rekon on his way back. It couldn't be the other way around. Once a mitzvah comes into your hands, you should be mekayim it immediately. Therefore, the Kohen would stretch out his arm to receive the mole that had the dam in it, because that's the real mitzvah, and that would come first. And then he would look to receive the empty mizrach and send it back, which was really not a mitzvah; it was only a preliminary stage. Kohen HaKarvetz Mizbeach, the Kohen who was closest to the Mizbeach, he did the zrika, and as we said, the zrika was Keneged HaYesod. Mantana Pesach Zrika Omer Rabbi Chizda Rabbi Yossi Aglili. We have a machlokes about how to do the dam, the avodas hadam on the Mizbeach. According to Rabbi Yossi, you do it with zrika, and we're going to see how he learns that. And the other Tanoim disagree. They held it was shvicha. Shvicha means not to throw it at a distance, but to bring the dam close to the mizbeach itself and just let it down. Hanocha. The Sanya we learned to the Brayso of Yosef Omer. It says with regard to that krov of a bechar, behema, ach bechar shar es domam tizok al mizbeach es chelgom taktir. So you see clearly that we're talking about zrika. And now let's be the dike. The language is domo. Does it say domo? No, it doesn't say domo. It should have said domo. It's referring to one korban and one korban olam. So why does it say domam in Lashon Ramin? So this is an allusion to the korban Pesach. Again, it also says in the same pasuk about chelbam in the plural taktir. Chelbo lo nemer el chelbam. Limed. And this is going to teach us on a triangular relationship. This is what I call the three musketeers. Bechar, Pesach, Maaseh. They form one unit. And many of the dinim are derived one from the other. And in this case, Shehein Te'una Matan Dovim V'Murim Al Gabi Mizbeach. From Rabbi Yossi Agli's drasha, we derive that the Matan Dam of the Korban Pesach is going to be derived and equated to Bechar. And the Torah says in Bechar it's Tizrog. And therefore we learn, according to Rabbi Yossi Agli, that the Dam of Pesach also requires Zrika al Gabi Mizbech, and not Shficha, which is the other Shita. And Minolan the Tunim Yisod, the Mishnah says that the Dam has to reach the Yisod, and that's the outside step on the bottom of the Mizbeach. Om Rabbi Lazar, that's derived from Korban Ola. Asya, we have Gzeres Shava, Zrika, Mi Ola. Ksiv Hacha here in the Pasuk Bechar Maser Pesach. That requires Matan Dom. It says Es Domam Tizrok Al HaMizbeach. Uksiv Hasam in the Parsha of Ola. It says V'Zarkua Bnei Aaron Hakon Es Domo Al Mizbeach Saviv. Now, when it says in Ola at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, Es Domo Al Mizbeach Saviv is a reference to the Yisod. And now we're going to set up this Gzeret Shava of Zrika. And Ma Ola Tuna Yisod, when the Torah explicitly requires Yisod in the case of Ola, and it says Zrika is Af Pesach, where it also says Zrika, Nami Ton Yisod, it also requires Yisod. And finally, to finish the sugya here on Daf Samachayam and Alfi, Ola Guf Minon, how do you know the Ola requires Yisod? Omar Kra, the Torah says, with regard to the chatos of the nasi and the melech, it says, "V'lakacha kohen midama chatos be'etzvo v'nasan al karnos mizbech olah mizbach ha'olah v'estamo yishpoch el yisod mizbach ha'olah." It could have said el yisod mizbech. Why does it say olah? Alma olah te'una yisod. So once we know that olah requires yisod, and we know that olah requires zrika, we're going to require in Korban Pesach, where the Torah also indicates Zrika, that we require a Yisod, and the Zrika has to be on the Yisod. This is where we'll complete it for today, and I'll wish everyone a great day. Tomorrow, Daf Samachay for the Daf Yomi.